So, greetings, hello. It's Dr Thomas Daffern again here, and it's Sunday, the 5th of May, and I'm talking, it's my normal weekly fast day against Brexit, which I regard as a total calamity for the UK and for Europe. And I recorded last week, I explained, I've taken the step of setting up a Centre for Bremain Studies, which is the opposite of Brexit. As a scholar and academic, I think academics throughout the UK and Europe and elsewhere, all people that love Britain, should work together to find out where this Brexit catastrophe came from, who thought it was a good idea, and who's been pushing for it. I've written, I'm at work on a book about that. I've detailed 217 questions, really, or areas of research that we need to go into with a fine-tooth comb, involving legal questions, constitutional questions, philosophical questions, indeed theological questions about this Brexit idea, because it does have the potential to break up the UK, which has been in existence since 1603, well, as Great Britain. And it's an utter catastrophe. I think anyone that loves our country should be up in arms about this, not literally, but in intellectual terms. So now this week I have good news to announce, because we've had these local elections in the UK, not in Scotland or Wales, but in England and Northern Ireland. And the results are pretty overwhelmingly consistent with my proposal that we need to seriously rethink Brexit and to support Remain parties. The Conservative parties lost a total of 1,334 seats in these council elections. It's a complete rejection of the Conservative Party and all that it stands for, and I think this is a rejection for many reasons. The whole Brexit phenomena, the nightmare that is Brexit, is a creation of the Conservative Party, and it's it's been proposed and masterminded by Theresa May, and it's a nonsense, it's a nightmare. People are saying, no, that's enough. Winchester has gone. A lot of the heartlands of conservatism in its best sense have now gone back to the Liberal Democrats. The city of Winchester, which I know and love very well, the cathedral there near which I used to live, this has gone to the Liberal Democrats. They are the authentic voice, it seems to me, of right-thinking, sensible England, and the people of Britain are, agreeing with me. They elected 703 new councillors across the whole of England for the Liberal Democrats, who represent the best of the liberal tradition, the best of the social democratic tradition. They're a centrist, centre-left party of common sense and intelligence, who are campaigning tooth and nail, night and day, to keep Britain inside the European Union. I support them 100%. And many of my friends have been elected as councillors, so congratulations to all of them. Well done, they deserve it. The Labour Party, which continues to fudge and do what it calls constructive ambiguity under Jeremy Corbyn, who, with all due respect, seems to have utterly and totally lost the plot. I've lost any respect I used to have for this man because of his peace policy, and because he seemed like an old-style Labour Fabian type. I'm afraid I've lost any respect I used to have for him, and I think he should resign as Labour leader and be taken over by someone who realises that only Bremain will save the Labour Party and guarantee that they will have a future in governing the country. The British people, I think, have found it very difficult to forgive the Labour Party for its role in the Iraq War. They're starting from a deficit of trust. I personally would never vote for the Labour Party again after that fiasco, and also the way they dealt with the foot and mouth disease and other things. Labour simply seem to lack sort of intelligence when the chips are down. And this poor showing over Brexit is yet further evidence that unfortunately the Labour Party simply don't seem to have a kind of mechanism for electing both intelligent and good leaders who actually see the bigger picture and are clever enough to to take on the Conservatives. John Smith was such a leader, and he died, to me, under mysterious circumstances. There was no proper inquiry into his death. I still think John Smith was probably assassinated, as I think happened to Robin Cook. Discuss. I'm a historian, and I know enough about how intelligence groups operate behind the scenes to know that these are possibilities. And it's unfortunate. It's possible Corbyn is just so terrified of the establishment that he's been silenced. He's been taken into a dark room by Theresa May and told, if you oppose me, I'll reveal this, that and the other. I think Theresa May is misusing her right to access intelligence for personal vendettas and to try and push through her Brexit thing. She's just as the Labour Party did under Blair during the Iraq War, when they misused intelligence to fool the British people into thinking attacking Iraq was A, legal, B, necessary, and C, constitutional, all of which were wrong. I think Theresa May and the Conservatives have misused British intelligence to scare everyone into thinking they have to go for Brexit. It's a top-down scaring mechanism, and it won't work with any genuine lovers of Britain. Any free-thinking, genuine, right-thinking people who reject that kind of bullying and intelligence-led scare operation. If you think British intelligence isn't that evil, then I'm afraid you haven't read your modern history of Britain and Europe. Because, I discovered something that shocked me a few years ago, which is that, as a historian, right, there's a network in Cambridge University that studies the history of intelligence. It's where Sir Christopher Andrews lives, who's written the histories of British intelligence. And, as a historian, I studied diplomatic history at the LSE, and I went a lot into intelligence history. We had some of the great scholars there who were my teachers. One of the less effective scholars was a man called Dr Alan Sked, who then lost the plot and set up UKIP, bless him. But there were some seriously good historians, including historians of intelligence, and I've always known how important it is, and so I'm always watching for signs behind the scenes, right, as a historian of 20th century history. And in the intelligence seminar, which meets at Cambridge University, they discovered, a historian had gone through the archives and discovered that during the war period, in the First World War, British intelligence had funded the rise of Mussolini, the fascist leader. They put him on their payroll, and they funded him for a period of a few years, during which he was a useful agent to British intelligence, right? And his argument, why we funded him, I use the word we loosely, was because he was pressing for Italy to join World War I on the side of Britain and France, and to oppose Austria-Hungary and Germany. Now, at that point, Italy was tending towards neutrality. It didn't want to join the war. And there were a lot of peace campaigners, a lot of intellectuals, a lot of people campaigning saying, these countries are mad, France and Germany, let them get on with it. Let's stay out. It's not in our interests. And, British intelligence was so cynical. And by the way, I use the term loosely. It's not British intelligence. It's British Machiavellian, interfering, scheming, illegal foreign interference, right? I don't have words that will be strong enough. They funded Mussolini and bankrolled the rise of fascism in order to bring Italy into World War I. Now just think about the consequences of that for the Italian people, for Europe as a whole. Now, any intelligence service that would be that evil, and to me it is evil, right, would stop at nothing, like killing off a few Labour leaders, whatever. And so the fact that British intelligence, so-called, also runs the BBC, and this has been proved by numerous revelations, numerous studies. You don't get an appointment to a senior level in the BBC, and haven't since it was set up in the 1920s, unless you're vetted and approved by British intelligence. Because there's a certain line that the British state, the governing powers, insist on being held. And if it's not held, your voice is not heard. So Britain has a very narrow band of what is acceptable. And the British intelligence services control the media, the mass media, the BBC. Now, these are facts. I'm not, this isn't conspiracy theory. This is history. And obviously they're still doing it. I mean, you just have to watch what the BBC is doing to see. And the way that it's come out 100% for Brexit since the 2016 referendum, which was a knife edge of ambiguity in which Ireland, Northern Ireland and Scotland did not vote for Brexit. The way the BBC suddenly interpreted it as if it was a triumphant victory for leave, hallelujah, we're all leaving, and aren't we happy, and we'll have little victory parades and, issue new medals and give the Queen a new yacht. I find it utterly unbelievably lacking in morality and intelligence, the way the BBC has become basically a trumpet chorus for the Theresa May cabinet and their position of we're doing Brexit as soon as we can. So there are huge constitutional issues arising from this Brexit fiasco, which my Centre for the Study of Bremain will go into. And that includes we need an independent media. The BBC should sack and remove from its board, from its governing body, anyone connected with British intelligence, so-called. They should have to swear an oath that they're not a member of British intelligence. And if they won't take that oath, then they should be thrown out. Because we need a seriously independent media service in Britain that can tell the truth. You see, if you have a media service that is controlled by intelligence, it doesn't tell the truth. It tells what the powers that be, the government, so-called, want you to think is the truth. And what is at stake in Brexit is truth, actually. Now, the BBC has huge responsibility for having elevated Nigel Farage, for having elevated these right-wing populist opinions, which, are a nightmare for any right-thinking person. Now, I'm therefore incredibly relieved and delighted that the British people have seen through all this nonsense. They don't know the details. I've spent years training as a forensic historian. I can tell you the details. They don't need to know the details. They intuitively know that Brexit is bad news and the Conservatives cannot be trusted. Any right-thinking person with an instinct for conservatism, preserving what's good about British society, preserving our constitution, preserving our constitutional monarchy, preserving parliamentary democracy, etc., preserving our countryside, preserving a sort of spiritual bond that unites people that can't be written down. This is why we rejected French revolutionaryism, because the British Conservatives said, well, you don't go around chopping the heads off aristocrats, you respect them. But on the other hand, the aristocrats have to respect the common people. And, there was a sort of deal done in British society whereby all classes worked together for the common good. That was conservatism at its best. It's sometimes called one nation conservatism. Well, I'm afraid this Conservative Party has torn up all those principles by pushing Brexit under this woman Theresa May. She either she fundamentally fails her exam in morality. She fails it in cerebral, cognitive functioning. She has she fails it in respect. She's often extremely rude in the House of Commons. She's been rude to just about everybody. And I find her a despicable and unworthy bearer of the office of Prime Minister. She should be gone. And this is what the British people are saying. 1,334 Tory councillors throughout the country have lost their seats. All those people should simply say, look, I'm sorry, I'm resigning the Conservative Party. Anyone with any conscience, we have... all the serious intellectuals in the Conservative Party are ashamed of what has happened under Theresa May and this Brexit policy, because they know it's going to do everything that Conservatives are supposed not to do. It's going to break up the country. How is that conserving anything? It's going to alienate anybody from ever voting for them again, which is how's that in any way sort of a one-nation party. All it is doing is pandering to the extreme right in British politics, who are essentially the same fascist crew that Mussolini gathered together and in Italy. I mean, there is a fascist undercurrent in British politics, and it seems to have taken charge. It seems to have taken control of the BBC and the intelligence services. And anyone that realises that should be joining me in blowing the whistle very loud and clear here. Okay, so Labour Party, with its constructive ambiguity, so-called, which is actually destructive ambiguity, lost also 84 seats, but far less than the Conservatives. Because the other reason the Tories are not popular is because of what they've done to the economy, because of the catastrophic hemorrhage of jobs and opportunities that Brexit represents. The poverty. I've heard from people who've changed their minds, who voted Leave, and have did so because they thought the economy would improve. They live in a high unemployment area, etc. And yet, when they see the reality of what Brexit has done, they've totally changed their minds. They've come over to Remain because although it's got lots of faults and flaws, the European Union has helped the collective economic advancement of all the European nations, and preserve the peace, and help the cultural, educational attainments, and supported the arts, and all the civilised things that a proper civilization does. Brexit is utterly a narrow-minded populist right-wing coup, which is anti-European in flavour and trying to destroy decimate all that tradition. So, Labour also lost seats. It's not a mandate for Jeremy Corbyn to say, well, we're going to do Brexit more. No, it's the complete opposite. It's a mandate for the Labour Party to come to its senses, realise that Brexit is against the interests of the working people of Britain and of the whole of Europe. Listen to the voices of European socialists who are calling that loud and clear. And I would like to point out today, in 1818, on the 5th of May, Karl Marx was born in Trier on the Rhineland. And I'm doing a commentary on Das Kapital, as some people may know. As a scholar, as a sort of, among many other things, I'm a bit of a Marxologist, an expert in Marxism. I've written books about Marx. My mother was a Marxist. I've brought up with that tradition, and I don't regard myself as a Marxist, but I regard myself as a Marxologist. I'm very interested in his theories and how he arrived at them. He was a descendant of great rabbis and a great learned man, but he was too fixated on his one particular kind of contribution, in Das Kapital. All intellectuals have flaws. He had many good qualities, but he also had flaws. And the irony of Marx, as I pointed out in one of my books, is really he was a romantic. He was the last great romantic poet of the Victorian age. You just see him with his long beard and his long hair, strolling over Hampstead Heath, reciting nursery rhymes to his daughters. He was a lover of romance, and for him, communism was an ideal that humanity would achieve. He thought he would help that by being really strict and scientific about it, and writing out the details of how capital works and how it's theft, actually, from people's labour. And he was extremely good at describing the conditions of poverty in Britain, in working class areas in Manchester, in Wales. He describes the cottages and hovels of West Wales. There's clay on the floor, there's dripping water everywhere, there's no sanitation, there's a miserable subsistence living. He describes the conditions of the Irish during the famine and afterwards, taken from government reports of how people were dying of mass starvation. And this is at the very time when capitalists in England were beginning to accumulate huge concentrations of capital and invest them in industrial works, the railways and so on. Marx is saying, how is this possible? How do we have a few hundred miles from each other peasants dying of mass starvation and capitalists sitting in their London clubs smoking cigars and creaming the fat off? That's what he was concerned to find out. He was obviously very close friends with Engels, who was his best friend and colleague for many years. And Engels had an Irish girlfriend in Manchester, the love of his life, Mary Burns, who he loved very much. And who actually was in touch with all the working class people of Ireland who'd fled from the famine and come to live in Manchester. She showed him what it was like to be poor and Irish living in Britain at that time. And she told them the horror stories of what they were hearing about going back on, in their own country. Now, I've heard some really terrible, shocking things in the Brexit debate by people saying, well, the Irish, yeah, well, who cares about them? Let them sink. We're doing Brexit. I find this utterly shocking and appalling, as would Marx were he alive. And, so should any genuine person that cares about society as a whole. The fact is, Britain and Ireland are one culture, the Wessex culture, the Boyne culture. As a Druid, I've studied the archaeology of these ancient Celtic regions, and they share one common culture. The people that were making the wonderful gold lunulae in Newgrange culture, of which there are examples in the Irish Museum in Dublin, to a very, very fine degree of high goldsmith art in about 1600 BC, 1700 BC. Exactly the same people were doing the same in the Wessex culture. Interestingly enough, the only other place I've seen such fine gold work of intricate patterns is in Mycenae, in the museum in Greece, in Mycenae. So I'm 100% certain the Mycenaean Greeks, the Druids and the craft smiths of Ireland and Wessex culture were all into communication. We know there's a Mycenaean dagger on Stonehenge. Mycenaean Greeks were visiting Britain, they were visiting Ireland, and vice versa. In the Druid traditions of Ireland, the Druids at one point, came from Mycenaean Greece and passed through Egypt. This Druidry is a cosmopolitan internationalist outlook on the world, because we think in cosmic terms. We think in thousands of years, like Enoch. We think in terms of the next, 10,000 years. And we think of the planet as a whole. Irish cosmologists and geographers had worked out, the Earth. There was a famous Irish bishop in Salzburg called Virgil or Fergal, who was teaching the sphericity of the Earth, the description of the maps of the heavens, and he was accused by his rival of being a heretic because he was going against the sort of fixed Earth idea of Babylonian cosmology that seems to be in the Bible. Anyway, he appealed to the Pope and was totally vindicated. The Pope said, "This is a brilliant Irishman. Listen to him." And so and here's picture. True Druidry is about the advancement of learning and knowledge, and it runs through all of the best of British and Irish civilization and European. And I'm so appalled that Brexit is so obviously an own goal and shooting oneself in the foot, that how can a culture that could produce such genius as we see in that gold work in the lunulae of which was the badge of being a senior Druid, by the way, in Ireland and Wessex culture, how can a culture that could produce that 1600 years ago, suddenly be overswept by a kind of madness of ignorance and go for Brexit? Well, that's what the Centre for Bremain Studies is going to have to work out. I mean, I have my views on that, and I think that there are psychoanalytical explanations, sociological explanations, there are psychological explanations, there are all kinds of types of academic discourse that will be helpful to explain it. I think that there's a philosophical explanation, which is what I call Sophiophobia, the fear of too much knowledge, too much wisdom, is another possible avenue of explanation. So, there are many explanations, but the explanation really is, why is there ignorance in human history? I mean, this was the problem Marx was grappling with in the 19th century, because why would anybody let the Irish starve to death like that in their millions? Where was compassion? Why didn't compassion kick in? The trouble was that in English intellectual circles by that time, there had become a trend towards materialism, and this idea of history was sort of determinist, set in stone, cast iron laws of history, and if the peasants are starving and dying, well, there must be something wrong with the peasants. There was ethics had been thrown out of the window by this this Faustian bargain with science done by certain kinds of circles in British intellectual life, who argued that there is no God, there is no ethics, there's no spirit, there's no conscience, there's just naked power battles. Now that surfaced as what I call vulgar Darwinism. It became vulgar Darwinism. And that ideology later influenced pseudo-scientific circles that thought that, well, I'll be clever and I'll be a Darwinist, and I'll explain everything, conscience, goodness, love, all the rest, just as sort of mechanistic, materialistic processes going on in the human being, who is just a machine. Now, if you think human beings are just machines, well, it doesn't matter if a few million of them die, because, well, you can make new machines, yeah? If they have no souls, if they have no feelings, that's fine, slaughter them. Now, unfortunately, that was the same ideology that Hitler later developed, and there are definite trails of evidence pointing to the Hitler's ideology. There's a very important book by an American philosopher who's written a book called Hitler's Ethic, which is the first really detailed study by a philosopher of where Hitler was actually coming from in his thinking. I mean, obviously it should have been done years before. And it's unlike the work of Nicholas Goodrick Clark, who's a great, who was a good friend of mine, a theosophist and historian, who was professor of esoteric history at the University of Exeter before he died, tragically, sadly lamented, who did a PhD on Hitler's occult influences. And he did that with, an Oxford Don, and went into it very thoroughly and found, yes, Hitler had dabbled in all kinds of occult groups, and he sort of argued that was the source of Nazism and anti-Semitism. What this American professor of philosophy, who's written Hitler's Ethics, says is that's kind of, there's truth in that, but it's not the whole explanation. And he puts forward a whole body of evidence that is, I think, more convincing than Nicholas's, in which it was neo-Darwin thinking, neo-Darwinianism, that inspired Hitler. He literally believed in the fight to the death between the races. And he was inspired to think, if that's the right word, demonically possessed by this fear that if my race isn't out there killing the other races, then we'll die. And he thought he was doing Germans, whatever they are, I'm part Anglo-Saxon, I'm a German too, but you don't elevate your own race by killing other races. The only path, we should have learned this by reading St. Paul and the Gospel years ago, is through love, right? The greatest philosophers of Greece were half Phoenician, like Thales, like Pythagoras. They were mingling and mixing with Druids, like Aberys from the Hyperborean lands, which is the British Isles. So Hitler was someone who was influenced by this fanatical materialism of Darwinianism, and look where it got us. It got us into utter catastrophe as a continent and as a world. So when you see somebody coming along with those kind of thinking patterns, you have to oppose them, and you have to deconstruct their worldview and say, no, actually, there is such a thing as ethics. There is such a thing as, well, there probably is. I think there is such a thing as spirit. There is such a thing as God. These are faith beliefs that are embedded in human history that are as ancient as the hills or the South Downs where I grew up in Brighton. So that's why I compiled this, the periodic table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions. Okay, each of these different colours and boxes have a lineage and a tradition which are very ancient. So you have the Christian ones are the light blue, the Buddhist ones are these reddish ones, the Jewish are coming down there, Chinese, pagan, new religious movements, philosophical traditions, Iranian, Persian inspired like Zoroastrianism and so on, Indian, Hindu are here, and the Jain are the white ones in the middle because they advocate total non-violence and so on. It's a cartography to explain, and Darwinianism, materialism, yes, it's there as one of the humanisms. Yeah, fine. I'm not saying there aren't great scientists I'm not saying Darwin wasn't a great scientist. I mean, I was married to one of his relatives for some years and have 2 children with her, so I do know, how that lineage came about and what its thought world was. And I don't disrespect Thomas Huxley and his work as a scientist. I'm not anti-Darwinianism. I am simply saying that it needs to be supplemented by a much more sophisticated theological discourse than the fanatical Darwinians were doing. And the trouble is, Hitler was semi-educated, hardly barely educated, didn't understand the complexity. There were brilliant professors at the University of Vienna at the time who could have set him right, you know. So where do we go? So my problem with Brexit, philosophically, it's as if it wants to destroy all this beauty and this complexity. It reduces everything to a banal simplicity. Hannah Arendt said that evil is always banal. It oversimplifies things. It says, no, shipment of Jews to the death camps, sign here. You know, no argument, no discussion. Like, that's not right, is it, sir? Like, I shouldn't be doing that, should I? You know, conscience? No, not allowed. It reduces everything to a banality, whereby this would all just be one box. And there are people in all the boxes that want that. They want their religion to become the biggest, the only. There are people in the Muslim law, which is the green one, in the Wahhabi tradition. Again, a semi-educated lineage of originally heretical Islamic view that because of the accident of oil money has become a dominant one. So they would love to colour every single box green and everyone else would be killed off, you know. That is a heresy, my friends. There were, in olden times, some in the Catholic box, which is this one, the Roman Catholic box, who would have quite liked every other box to be coloured, you know, deep blue, and if you weren't a Catholic, you were a heretic, and so everyone else gets killed off. This is why on the Armada, when they sent the ships around, there were inquisitors with torture equipment coming from Spain to attack, you know, people like me who were free-thinking people following the work of John Dee and allowed by Queen Elizabeth to do actual philosophy, like Bacon and the whole miracle of the Elizabethan Renaissance. That's what I'm fighting hard to preserve, that freedom of thought that Britain became, and that miracle of freedom of thought, which has given us people like Sir William Jones, one of my great heroes, who was a Druid, right? Druids are up here in the green boxes, from Wales. But he became the chief judge in Calcutta. He was a Christian also, as I am. And he studied at the University of Oxford, where I also taught. And he discovered Indo-European languages. He was fluent in about 10 languages. And he learned Sanskrit and realised, hey, there's one huge language family here. It's called Indo-European. He named it. So the beauty is keeping the diversity and yet finding the unity in the middle of it all. So don't please turn it all into one box. That's what fanatics do. And the Brexit banality is let's destroy Europe, let's take it down. People like Steve Bannon say they want to stick a stake through the heart of the European Union. I mean, that kind of hate speech reminds me of Goebbels. Farage and Bannon remind me of Goebbels. You know, it's that kind of keep repeating the lie again and again and again, and you'll, you know, convince people. Well, thank God the British people are more intelligent, and I wasn't a teacher in Britain for 10 years for nothing. You know, I did educate a few thousand people over those years, and for 10 years before that I was teaching higher education. So UKIP has totally lost its you know, it's completely irrelevant. It's a nightmare. It was invented by my friend Alan Scared, who was a misled academic. I mean, I don't want to say anything personally against Alan, but I do think he was misguided in his hatred of Europe, you know. We should also remember, it's quite interesting this, that on this day Napoleon died in 1821, 5th of May, everything's happening at once. Napoleon had a dream of uniting Europe. He was a great man, he was a great thinker, he was respectful of law, he understood, you know, many things, but his vision of Europe was it would be united by violence, and you know, you can't do that. It's his life